morning. Please. I'm Harriet Himasi, University Librarian at Brown, and I'm very pleased to welcome you into this wonderful space, which has been open for less than 2 years at Brown. It's the Patrick Maw Digital Scholarship Lab. Patrick and his wife have a daughter who is graduating this year, and they made this wonderful investment in the lab, which is both a teaching and presentation space, as well as a space where students and faculty come together and work on digital projects. I'm very pleased to introduce this morning one of our favorite professors at Brown, Professor Jim Egan, who came to Brown in 1991 after receiving his PhD from UC Santa Barbara. Not only is Jim an experienced researcher and dedicated teacher, he's also a member of the Library Advisory Board, so I really like him. He's also a consistent user and supporter of all collections at Brown, but in particular special collections and the John Hay Library, which is right across the street and has been undergoing a renovation this year. It will reopen in the fall. Jim regularly incorporates special collections and other library materials into his undergraduate classes that have intriguing titles such as Devils, Demons, and Do-Gooders, and Inventing America. Doesn't it make you want to be a student? Over the last couple of years, Jim has developed an avid interest in digital humanities. And he's going to talk to us today about the transition of humanities and incorporating digital methods. He's currently working with library staff on the Colonial America's Publishing Project. And you may show us some of that today or not.
I wasn't planning to, but I'm happy to.
Anyway, it's an interesting project that maps online literary genres and places of publication across the early American hemisphere. To date, his visualizations include items printed before 1800 that are housed both in the John Hay Library and the John Carter Brown Library that's on campus. Out of Jim's own research pursuits, cultivated to a great extent by working with librarians in the Digital Scholarship Lab, this very place, Jim came to the idea of teaching a digital humanities class, just as he was teaching himself, and I think this is so key and so unique to Brown. He decided it was important to also teach his students about these new methods and approaches to scholarship. Approaches that are important today, but more important as the 21st century progresses. Last summer, the library sponsored an UTRA. Do you know what an UTRA is? An Undergraduate Teaching and Research Award. So it's for a student who then works specifically with a faculty member on a particular project. And that project was to develop a new class, which Jim taught this spring in this very space. And he'll talk about the new class, but also the ways in which he has changed his own research and the ways he's changed his own teaching. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jim Egan.
Thank you, Harriet. Thank you all for coming. Boy, what a pleasure to see you all here. I did teach in this room this semester, and I can tell you that this is more people who've been in this room. It's kind of disorienting, to be honest with you. I also just want to say, before I get started, two things. One, I'm probably going to focus a little bit more on teaching, on explicitly teaching than research today. How this is the overview. Well, no, let me back up one step, because after that introduction, I do want to say that, one, teaching in this room this semester has transformed both my teaching and my scholarship. I don't think I can teach the same way ever again. B, working with the librarians, both outside of this room and in this room, my scholarship has been fundamentally transformed so that I can never do scholarship the same way again. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. Here's how it's going to go. First, I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes. I don't want to talk for more than 15 minutes, and I have my co-presenter today, or one of the students from the class who's going to talk about the class. I don't want to shortchange her because she's going to give some really interesting insights too. And since I am a professor, I can go on for a lot. I can stand up here for the rest of time. But Miranda Olson, who I'll be telling you a little bit more about, is going to give me a signal after about 10 or 15 minutes. Right, Miranda? Okay, good. Excellent. Yeah. Kelsey, who is also in the class. Kelsey, there's another student from the class. Kelsey, if you're looking at your watch too, just raise your hand and say, Egan, it's time. Okay. So that being said, so we've got an hour, so I'm going to talk. Miranda's going to talk. And then we're going to have some questions, but please feel free. We want this to be an interactive engagement. That's part of what this room is about. At least it was to me when I taught. It's been that way as a researcher too. When I come in here with with the librarians who are digital humanists on my research stuff, what this room does for me, and I think for the students, is produce conversation that you can't get in any other environment. So I hope you guys will feel comfortable to raise your hands and ask questions and interrupt as you go along. And the other thing I have to tell you as a way of prelude, although it's sort of all prelude, is that this room is fantastic and this screen is amazing, but sometimes the internet is not. So that when we go online, as I want to just show you a little bit, the site that we'll be looking at sometimes goes down. So, just be forewarned, I have some ways to deal with that. So me, Miranda, then some questions. What we want to do is we want to put in action today the title. That is the continuity amidst transformation. We want to put in action, show you in action how the humanities, or I should say really literary studies, because that's what I do. I don't really think, oddly enough, I don't really think of myself as a humanist. I mean, I am, of course. I think of myself as a literary scholar. So I want to show you today, Miranda and I want to show you today how using these new digital tools, I'll tell you a little bit more about the one that we used mostly today, using these digital tools and computational tools, some of the fundamental questions that we have as digital humanists, or as humanists, remain. First thing, before I say a little bit more about that, I want to get to the next slide. By the way, this is just what you see here is a word cloud of one of the stories that we might be talking about today, but let's go to the next slide. So there are so many computational tools. There are so many things that digital humanists, have developed to analyze literary texts. We really focused only on one category of tools. And that category of tools is called distant reading, which you may have heard a lot about recently. A person who wrote a book with this title, Franco Moretti, that book, which is a collection of essays, won a recent Book of the Year award. I cannot remember the name of the award. I'm terrible with that kind of thing. But the title of the book is Distant Reading. And what that means is understanding literature not by studying particular texts, not by reading individual texts, but by analyzing the results of applying computational tools to databases of massive numbers of literary works. So that's one of the things Harriet mentioned, my Mapping Colonial Genres project. That's one of the things we do, using library catalog data. That means things like, the call numbers, the publication names, the titles, unbelievably messy and seemingly useless, or not useless, but limited information. With the help of a digital humanist, we've managed to mine this information to make sense of all these details, well, not all of them yet, but some of them, about how genres change over time and in different places in colonial America. Primarily North America, but also South America. But anyway, analyzing the results of applying computational tools to databases of massive numbers of literary works. This, though, is something that was generated by an undergraduate in my class this semester. His name is Nicholas Lowry, and what he did was he went through all of the poems of Emily Dickinson. Well, he did not read all of the poems of Emily Dickinson, though that would be a wonderful experience, and he likes Emily Dickinson. He used a computational tool, mining the e-text of Emily Dickinson's poems to generate a map of what places were named in poems by Dickinson. And he then compared that map to other maps of writing by Thoreau, of writing by Whitman, and a series of other writers to ask about the question that has often arisen in American studies of American literature: what is the relationship between place and genre, or place and literary movements in America? There are cosmopolitan writers, and there are local color writers. And it turns out one of the things that he seems to have discovered, although we're not really sure, it's a limited database, limited time, is that whereas the cosmopolitan writers tend to have their works focus on very limited places in Europe, the local color writers tend to focus, have mentioned local places, but have many more references to places that are far flung from those local places. So, that's distant reading, that's what we focused on. The course was called Literature in the Digital Humanities because most people don't really know what the digital humanities is, including most digital humanists. I shouldn't say that there's a digital humanist in the background. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to slam you, Andy, but you know what I mean. Like the definition of digital humanities is one of the things that digital humanists argue about. We did not do that in the class because I didn't want us to worry about that. So I took a broad definition. This is from Julia Flanders, who's a digital humanist at Northeastern. Digital humanities studies the intersection and mutual influence of humanities ideas and digital methods with the goal of understanding how the use of digital technologies and approaches alters the practice and theory of humanities scholarship. So what happened was, on Monday, they would read something, a work of literature, a work of scholarship on methodology, a work about the digital humanities. Then on Wednesday and Friday, we would come in here, and students would be put in groups. The tables that you see along the side, there were no chairs in the middle, the tables were there. We would move the tables in whatever way we wanted to, right? Kelsey and Miranda, am I doing this right? And then students would talk among themselves, and then we would project things, and you could project multiple things on this screen at the same time. They would talk among themselves, and then we'd come together, and we'd talk about what we had discovered. It was difficult for me because I'm not an expert in. What would happen was students would generate stuff from their work that I hadn't anticipated. But let me get to the second thing about that. Here are the guiding questions that we used through the semester. I say guiding questions. I couldn't put it on the board or couldn't put it on the slide because I ran out of room, but one might say guiding questions, one might say annoying questions. Miranda and Kelsey, were you annoyed that I kept asking these two questions over and over again? Does this tool start interesting and potentially, then I was so interested I misspelled, and potentially productive conversations about literature? Does this tool activity lead you to rethink the categories you use to reflect on literary works and or literature in general? And this is what's called a Voyant skin. VoyantTools.org, which we'll look at in a second, is the tool we focused on. It's essentially a word counter. But it also does, and it generates a cloud. It generates graphs about the frequency of the words and where they appear, and it generates some other things we'll see in a second. But I just wanted to give you, in case the VoyantTools.org does not online, fails, which it does with some frequency, as all online tools do, and Miranda and Kelsey, you can back me up on this, it did all too often in our class. So we became really good at improvisation. They would generate data from this oftentimes, and then we would ask those two questions. And here's the DH tool we use too much, because eventually they got a little bored of it. And let's see if we get it here. This is Voyant. I just want to show you what you do. Now, I'm going to use Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart, which we talked about in class. I've gone to a website here. I'm going to copy the text. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do this. I'm doing it this way because this is the way that it works most often. I'm going to input that data or that text. Now I'm going to click Reveal. Keep your fingers and toes crossed. And if you can cross your toes, I'm very impressed. We have a word cloud being generated. The other, it might slow down. This might not work. But while it's doing that, I'm going to go here and see if I can use stop words. In other words, you can see that the is the first one. Who wants to know that the is the first one? It is the most frequently used word. So we use stop words, and there we get a word cloud generated. You can see if we click on a word, it then generates this. You can see the word in context. You can add another word. So how does head or let's go to heart. Let's go to heart, and then we'll add head. Thank you. Click that. And you can see that
what the scales are?
I'm going to let Miranda do this. Miranda, you want to tell them what the scales are? Because this became a point of contention.
I just don't know what I'm looking at.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what are you looking at?
Sure. Okay, so really quickly,
Right now, he's in a mode that's just about relative frequencies. So what you're looking at is actually these words in context to one another throughout the text. There's a setting that you can also just do raw frequencies, which is simply you're looking at the number of times that a word appears throughout a certain chunk of the text. What is slightly misleading about this sometimes is that you're actually looking at something that's like word bins. So it takes a text and it cuts it into different sections, and then it gives you the word frequency within that section. So each dot you can really picture as the top of a column. So like on a histogram or a bar graph or what you might normally see, except for they show it as a trend analysis line instead. Does that kind of answer the question?
No.
Okay, rather than try to say more about that, that's a great question. We could delve into this for a long time. Thank you, Miranda. She's going to come up in a second. What I want to use that to demonstrate is how different this class is than most lit classes I've taught, right? No one ever asked that question in a lit class. No one ever had to have the skill in a lit class to answer the question that Miranda just tried to answer, right? And you did a really good job, but it generates more questions. No. Part of the reason a lot of students in my class said no, they don't understand it, is because they aren't trained to understand it that way, right? But this kind of data, if you dig down, you ask the question you asked, you get some clear answers, you work the clear answers out amongst one another, it can give you access to ways of understanding that text in that we don't usually use in literature. So it can generate questions and ideas that normally you do not have in literature classes. And I hope Miranda and Kelsey will back me up. And Kelsey, you're come a very different background from Miranda. Kelsey's more a lit person. That is, you're getting your degree in English. Miranda comes from an engineering background. One of the great things about the class was that they had to be group learners, right? Everybody brought a different background and helped one another. That was so amazing. One tries to see that in literature classes, but oftentimes, and you do see that, but the range of skills and abilities was much different in this class, and people worked together in ways to bring the literature alive in ways that it had not been brought alive before. I have taught Poe's, Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, countless times over 23 years. We had discussions that I've never had before in this class, simply because one, you'd get this graph and then somebody would say, what am I looking at? Tell me, let us help us understand what's being plotted. And we would say, this is what it is. And then you'd say, yeah, but that doesn't work in this case or that case. And then so we would work it out. So you had both methodological discussions and content discussions. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next slide, not because I don't think that's important, but because we could spend the rest of the time there. Miranda, how am I doing on time? Okay, so I just want to tell you about the writing assignments. I've given them titles here. So I was scared to death to teach this course. Scared to death. I've never taught a course like this. And what kind of assignments do I give? So the first thing, did you forget again? What I did, again, Kelsey and Miranda will back me up on this. Every week, or approximately every week, I had them write reflections. Write a reflection on what we did this week, because it was so different, right? Thank you. It was so different. But I kept forgetting to have the questions, like by the end of the week. So somebody on Friday would say, Professor Egan, do we have a reflection due this weekend, or is there not one? And I'd say, oh yeah, you do. Sure, I'll get it up. So did you forget it? Do I really have to use this tool? Most students were really enthusiastic about using Voyant. But when you tell somebody who's a senior, who spent 4 years learning how to write a 5-page English paper and has gotten so good at it that they get an A, oh, by the way, your first paper you have to do a 5-page analysis, but the tool you must use is Voyant. They get really scared, just like me. And so some people would come to me in office hours, do I really have to use this tool? I like it, but I don't know how to use it in a paper. And I would say, what have you got to lose? Give it a shot. You've got 2 more papers to go. Who cares? You fail, you'll just do it differently next time. The third assignment, you've got to be kidding. You will rarely hear an English professor say this. For the second full paper, I told them, I'm going to give you text files of 10 novels from 19th century America that you will never have read, because how many people read other than Moby Dick and Scarlet Letter? These were really obscure novels. I'm going to give you text files. Do not read the novel. You are forbidden from reading the novel. Plug the stuff into the various tools and then see what you get. You think they were freaked out by the first assignment? You think I was freaked out by the second assignment? I had to figure out how to grade it. How do you grade an assignment where they haven't actually read the novel? I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. The third assignment, it was fantastic. It was fantastic because what it asked them to do was less read, quote unquote, the novel or analyze it. They had to do a little bit of that, but it forced them to say, what is it that I look for in reading? What do I expect to find when I read? Why do I value having this information, that is reading the text itself, that I'm missing here? One person in class, when we did this assignment in class, because we would often do stuff in class and then they'd write papers. One person, when she was saying, I'm uncomfortable with this, I said, why? Alicia, are you uncomfortable? She said, because I need the text. And I said, but you know, Alicia, that's all you have. But what that led us to was this amazing discussion about, well, what is a text? What's there in the text that's not there when you read it? That is, that's not there physically, but it is there some other invisible forces that you think of as textual, that are not in some strictly speaking way the text. These were so profound literary discussions about literature. Whoops. See, this happens. Andy is going to,
Plug it back in.
there you go. I can keep talking though while see, this is what Kelsey and Miranda, this kind of thing happened, right? See, and that, it's group work, yes, okay. There you go. So the last assignment was, what have you got to lose? By that I mean, I had them do, they could do either one of the first two writing assignments, or they could try something new. And I said, what do you got to lose? Try it. And some of the assignments they came up with were amazing. And you're going to hear about one in a second. Here were the questions. I'm not going to go through these, but here were the questions from the forbidden from reading assignments. These were the things I told them to think about. And you could see they're questions about what you value about literature in the first place, what kinds of underlying assumptions you bring to literary reading. And the thing I want to say about this course that relates to my research and the Mapping Colonial Americas project, after teaching this course, in the process of teaching this course, what I've learned is, what it's helped me do is, I actually love literature more now. Because using these kinds of computational tools that ask me to reimagine analysis in the first place, one of the things we talked about a lot in class was, why do we value literature in the first place? What is it that we love about it that we may be missing or get access to from this? So it forced me to say, wait, to re-examine this fundamental question that has led me on a life, that's all I do now essentially in my work, is I read great books. Think of that as a job, by the way. What a great job I have. Anyway, what do I value about them? And you can imagine how for undergraduates, majors or non-majors, they're all taking this class. In some way they love literature. They also, I think, had that kind of discussion that you rarely have in a literature class. Or in any kind of class. Why do you value this? And does this help you enhance that value, or does it not? Because I also told them over and over again, if you don't like this tool, if you think it's a problem, say it. You don't have to like it. The point is not to like it, the point is to stimulate discussion. All right, and with that ending on questions, the last assignment, I've had some amazing students at Brown, and I've had some amazing papers. But this semester in this class, it was over the top. So one student from the course has agreed to come and talk to you for a few minutes. She's going to show you a little bit of her final project. This is Miranda Olson. Miranda is a freshman who's came in engineering and English, right? And still kind of grappling with that, but then that's what you do at Brown, right? Is you come to Brown and you say, I don't know, let me explore. So she's going to talk to you about her final project. Is there anything else you want me to set up?
I think we're good.
Okay, so here's Miranda. I'm going to still be here, and again, interactive. I'm probably going to interrupt her because that's what I did in class all the time. Yeah, she's going to put that on, and we're going to get help from the tech people. Anybody have any questions while she sets that up?
How has that specifically changed how you read a novel now?
I now wonder, because one of the things about Voyant is you can chop up the text and put it in these computational tools like the first chapter, the second chapter, the third chapter. I now wonder, when I read a novel, what would this novel look like if I plotted out words, or there are some tools that are much more advanced that can read the words and come up with themes. What would this computational tool say the themes are, and how would that compare to my own? I now cannot read a novel, or even a short story, without thinking, what would computational methods show me about this novel that I might be able to ignore, because I can look and say, oh, well, that's just some weird function of the computation. Or I think, wow, I hadn't thought of that before. That really shows it to me in a different light. So now I can't do it anymore. Miranda, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, she sounds ready. I'm going to turn it over to her, but I'll have more questions later.
Okay. Hi guys, my name is Miranda, as he just said. So I am going to talk about this course from, once again, my perspective. A lot of these students, we all came with very different backgrounds. Engineering was a very different background approaching this course. I love literature, I love English, I love everything having to do with composition. At the same time, I definitely approach it from a more analytical perspective. So as I go through this, please ask me questions. Especially when I start confusing you about graphs or anything else, please ask me questions. I'm going to try to keep it as down to earth as possible. So as I go forward, I am going to talk about how I felt about the papers that he assigned. They were amazing. I loved them all. At the same time, they definitely pushed our comfort zone. So the first paper was one that was a very traditional analysis paper initially, and it was looking at a graph very similar to this. And basically he said, I want you to do a traditional analysis of one of these pieces. I chose Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart, which is what he just plugged in. And walking through it, basically you just plug in words. Because when we first started this paper, we had no idea how to use these tools. We didn't really have an understanding of how computational methods could help our literary analysis. And we didn't know what we were doing, which is why the first paper, it was good as a traditional analysis, because we just used it to supplement our traditional analysis. That said, when I looked at graphs like this, I saw one graph that I thought was absolutely amazing. It was I and he, which he's taken out of stop words. But basically, they had an inverse relationship. And I was just like, this could mean that these two characters kind of exist in different planes, and that they're actually both within the same character. So the two personas are the same person. And I kind of explored that analysis a bit.
Wait, can I interrupt you already?
Yeah.
How many people have read the Telltale Heart?
Yeah.
Excellent. That's part of the reason we picked it.
Yeah.
We thought a lot of people had read it. Okay, go ahead.
So that was my first analysis, was just saying I found this one voyant skin that I think is cool. Now I'm going to jump off of this and do traditional literary analysis. So the next paper was, you couldn't do that because we weren't allowed to read the piece. So I chose Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is it's a very long piece. And looking through it, I actually was able to piece together a lot of it. I predicted when Tom died, and surprisingly I got a lot.
Wait, let's do the question again. How many people have read Uncle Tom's Cabin? That's
a lot.
Percentage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically I was looking for character names, I was looking for plot, I was looking for some of the fundamental things you look for in a traditional analysis. That said, it was very, very difficult. And what I did for about probably 8 hours of going through this stuff, I could have done just by reading the book in a couple of hours. So it was extraordinarily frustrating, I think, for everyone in the class. I think Kelsey could agree with that one when we were just going through it. So definitely looking at it, it took a very long time. But I did realize that some things were easy to spot. You could find themes, motifs, some basic names and plot. The only thing is you get stuff wrong, too. So I thought St. Clair was a person's name, an individual's name, while really at the end it ended up being a last name of 5 people. So obviously that's not an accurate analysis of the text. So after going through that experience, I really realized that these computer analysis tools had the opportunity to give us 2 different things. They had the opportunity to give us the backbone of traditional literary analysis, so themes, motifs, plot, characters, some of the basic things, but not in a very detailed manner, not like you could get while reading it. But it also could help us generate some distinctive data and some results that we hadn't seen previously. And that's really what interested me, was seeing this whole new world that was opening up to literature. And through this experience, I really realized that I was controlling my literary analysis more than I ever thought it was possible. Because not only was I saying, I'm going to put this lens in front of my eyes and I'm going to look at the text from a historical deconstructive perspective, or something like that, I was actually creating the tool that was looking at it for me. So, and especially those of us who code, we actually created our own tools, which is really a cool part of the class. So I wanted to show you my final paper, which came out of all of these things that you're hearing and my thoughts about the class. And as you can tell, so this is my final paper. It's very different. And looking at it, the primary part of my project was an 8-slide PowerPoint. I think it was about 8. I can't either. So 10 with 2 works cited pages. So it was 8 actual content slides. And I think Egan was a little shocked when I first presented this because, it doesn't look like a traditional text. It's not, the assignment was just a 6 to 8 page paper. And I had written a 6 to 8 page paper. And then I'm like, this isn't what I want to do. This isn't what I see with this class. This isn't summarizing what I've learned and how I want to move forward. I really want to interact with text, not only analyzing it in the digital space, but also writing in the digital space.
I'm going to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
I just want to pause and show you what this class produced, right? She just said, correct me if I'm wrong, I wrote a 6 to 8 page paper, but then I decided, that wasn't really what I wanted to do. So she did another paper. I don't often have students write and then say, let's do that again. Okay.
Okay. So this format I chose because I'm really interested, coming from the sciences, I come from a background where a lot of the literature that we write in the sciences can be known as dry in other areas. Yes, okay, we kind of have some agreement there. And also, it's very unapproachable for non-science concentrators. I definitely found that out more than ever before in this class because I was like, oh, these graphs are easy to understand. And people are like, no, this makes no sense, like back off, like this doesn't make any sense. And that's totally a legitimate perspective. So I'm really interested in science writing, but beyond just writing about science, actually communicating some of the fundamentals of what you're saying in a very approachable manner for people from all different disciplines and different approaches to this type of material. And by doing that, I've always thought that interactive graphical links is a really cool way of doing that because it allows someone to see what they're doing in a visual format if that's how it works for them, but you can also interact with a textual format after going through the graphical format. So what this paper does is, as you can see, I wrote a little note here to try to explain it to him, but even that, the first time he read it through, he just looked at the slides, and he's like, I don't know how I'm going to grade this. I think it was the first thing he thought of, but that's okay.
I'm going to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
Honestly, when you get a book, and the book has pictures, don't you just go to the pictures first? That's what I did when I went to the slides. Oh, look at the pictures. So, go ahead.
So the way I organize this paper is that you can click on these, if it'll allow me to. There we go. And this opens the rest of another link in my paper. So throughout all 8 slides, my paper was written and chunked up throughout the slides. So the primary portion of my paper actually linked to a textual representation of my paper as well. So it was absolutely amazing to write. This is my opening slide, trying to help him understand what I'm thinking as I go through this, because I knew it would be interesting. And this was certainly an experience. And so my entire goal with this was to, I guess exactly what he first did, is look through the entire thing and understand exactly what I'm trying to say simply by looking at pictures. This breaking it down to the very fundamental primary thing that I wanted to get across. So I had slides like this, where this is clearer to most people than what I have written in text. But each one of these words connects to a different text, connects to another page in my paper. And then this is another graphic, and I'll go into these more in detail. But just as I walk through this is exactly what I was talking about in 10 pages of text about, but it's all in graphs, and it's all in images. So this one's just talking about the interdisciplinary field, and then there's a pyramid type of thing. But we'll be coming back to that too.
I can interrupt you again. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've been so intrigued by with the digital humanities, in both the teaching and the research, in some ways especially in research, is that the visual is a form of knowledge. It's not purely a after-the-fact representation of data, that it is actually a form of knowledge itself. And this queues up for scholars as a way of conveying information that most literary scholars don't really know how to do, and that's why I've had this, the library, I have to tell you, the library has been crucial to my development as a scholar. And they have, there are several librarians here who've been wonderful. My collaborator on that project has helped me understand this about visualization. From a teaching standpoint, though, it's also true that there are different kinds of learners. We all know this, that people respond to different kinds of presentations. The thing you're doing, Miranda, is combining those in ways that brings a lot of people in that in the past, people felt kind of shut out. So, go ahead.
Right. So as you can see, I went with a lot of graphics to try to explain my overarching goal. And we're going to back up to the top, and we're going to talk about some of these fundamental slides as kind of an overview of how I viewed the digital humanities after going through this class. But also just to talk about some of the bigger concepts of what we were exploring in this class, which was, how does this affect how we view literature? I mean, that was the fundamental question in this class, is how does what we're seeing here actually impact how I view literature? And it completely transformed the way I view literature, as well as writing. Writing this was extraordinarily difficult. It was a step-by-step process, and I had to, like, every half an hour I had to just sit back and be like, whoa, is this actually what I want? I had to take a second and take a deep breath, and I never do that while writing normal papers, so it was a new experience. And definitely because it had to be something that you could click on any of these links in a nonlinear fashion and yet understand what I'm saying. I couldn't repeat myself too much so that people reading just the text wouldn't get frustrated with me as an author. But it also, I had to be extremely clear in my graphics and the organization of it, and I had to present the material in a certain way. So it was a very challenging experience to me and really enjoyable. So this first slide, what I'm talking about is the interdisciplinary perspective of literary analysis. When you approach the digital humanities, which is a really broad field right now, we read a couple of papers on it, and basically the definition was something having to do with technology and literary analysis. Great. That's a helpful definition. After going through this class and seeing what people were doing within the digital humanities, you see a wide variety of projects dabbling in history and literature and a lot of different other fields. But I combined those into what I thought were the 4 primary fields, which was computer science, engineering, the fine arts, and the humanities. Computer science is really the new portion, as well as engineering, is really the new portion that's in the digital humanities. Because you're taking the traditional literary analysis found in the humanities and the traditional perspectives, and you're applying these different methodologies to it, even though that's not really how it's recognized right now. So each of these disciplines, I found, had their own way of generating results, however, whatever form that is. In the fine arts, it's going to be video, photographs, a lot of theater, performing arts. And then you have computer science, which is all about software development. It's all about moving forward through this. You have a basic process of designing code. It's working with a user, what do we want, what do we need, and how do I create an established product. And then you look down here in engineering, and it's very similar. We have what we call the design process, it's a user-centered design process, actually, UCD. And the user-centered design process is very much, we talk to a user before starting any of the development, and we ask them, what do you want? And you sit down for hours and hours and hours and try to figure out what they actually want, because it can be really hard to know what you're actually looking for in a product.
Literary scholars rarely ask people what they want. I would confess that.
But in the digital humanities, you have to ask someone what they want. And either if you're a coder in the digital humanities and you're working in an interdisciplinary team, you're asking the people around you, what do you need to find what you want? Otherwise, some people are coding for themselves, like I did and Nick did, and there's some people in the field who are coding themselves. And then you're asking yourself, what do I want? But combining all these practices into one discipline, there's really no standard methodology right now in this field. There's nothing that's a unifying factor of, this is how I approach my research, this is how I approach my project. It's kind of people doing what they feel like doing. So I tried to propose a methodology for this field. That was the goal of my end project. And it was a really big goal, but definitely I tried to pull from all the disciplines. I started from computer science, the technology design field. I then applied engineering, which is the user design process. I pulled in some stuff from the fine arts, which is traditionally critique, as you would call it, which is more of a studio thing. So I come up with my final product and people trash it. And then I start over again, and we start from scratch. And it's something that people, once again, I think in the humanities aren't as used to. And then I also took from the fundamentals of the humanities, how we lead to discussion of literature. It's someone writes something and then someone responds in a different literary piece. It's an ongoing discussion of this context. So this was my proposed analysis, which we're not going to get into in depth, but just the understanding of starting with a traditional literary analysis, I think, is the foundation of what we're trying to do. We're trying to stay within the context of, I understand this text on a fundamental level through reading it. And then we're moving into actually designing the digital humanities analysis interface, which is what I called it. And that's what I think is really unique in this field, is that by presenting, by coding, and by doing things like this, you're actually designing your experience with a text. It's an independent experience that you're creating and that you're coding or forging as you go through. So, but it's not only one tool. I mean, I definitely, within this interface, is also traditional literary analysis tools. And it can be multiple digital humanities. But I think when you look at it from a design and an engineering perspective, as well as computer science, which are all fundamental parts of the digital humanities, you're looking at something that is a design process. It's an ongoing transformative process where you're trying to figure out how you want to analyze the text and how you want to interact with the text. And that's a really unique perspective. I don't think that's one that many humanists take or literary scholars take when they're approaching a text. That it's not about finding that one pure truth that the author had in mind. It's about what experience do I want and what do I want to look at in this text and what do I want to get out of this text. And it's moving toward that ongoing thing. And as you can tell at the top, I have a continuous improvement cycle, which is something that I've never heard of a literary scholar including. I mean, I'm sure they work on like doing forward, but a continuous improvement cycle isn't just about trying to find more information. It's about actually changing your approach to get at better results. It's about redesigning this interface with the text and redesigning the tools and how you interact with the text to find a new end result or something that you may not have been looking for. And a continuous improvement cycle is something that's used in engineering as well as computer science, and it really does create this evolutionary process. It's something that's continually growing on itself and moving forward. And so when we're looking at this as a whole, that's really, to me, the greatest impact it had on how I view literature, is it's no longer about finding that one pure truth, especially when you have the digital sector, where the better you get with using the tools even, you have a different analysis. We saw it throughout the class. The better we got with Voyant, the more detailed our analysis got. So definitely it changed how I viewed literature, and I think how a lot of people in the class viewed literature, because it's no longer this one clear-cut meaning that we're trying to achieve. It's rather there are infinite amount of meanings that are continually changing and growing. So.
That was so cool. We wanted to leave a little time in case you guys had any questions.
Oh my.
You know, hand it back. Yes.
I'm old and old-fashioned. I'm wondering where the writer fits into all of this. Because when I read a novel,
Yeah.
I do a lot of that.
Yeah.
I want to know something about the writer,
Yeah.
about his background or
Yeah.
hers, experience,
Yeah.
and intention. And I don't know how you graph that. I don't know how you analyze that digitally by looking at the text alone.
Well, I'll be curious to hear your response too.
Go for it.
Boy.
Sorry.
No apology at all. That's a great question, and it's a question that we spent a lot of time talking about. Isn't that true, Kelsey? Are you yeah?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Because and so I'm not sure to your question. How do you graph that? I think there are ways in which you can use the authors. You can use these tools to find out things about the author. For instance, the person who was doing the Emily Dickinson stuff was really interested in finding out about stylistic and thematic issues in Dickinson that are very hard to get at when it's one individual reader reading the stuff. So one of the things that you can use these digital tools to do is sometimes the data is hard to get, right, because there's copyright stuff, but in the 19th century that's not true. So you can do all kinds of analysis on writers around Dickinson and on stylistic stuff about Dickinson and find out what they were like and compare them to her stylistic stuff, so that you can then refine your understanding of the themes, styles, and kind of obsessions about Dickinson. There are people now who are doing more historically centered digital analysis, about which I am familiar with, but don't completely understand the tools that they are using. But there are 2 books that are on my bookshelf that do exactly that say, how can I understand these particular authors in relation to larger cultural forces using these computational tools. I will also want to add, Kelsey and Miranda may back me up on this. One of the things I tell my students that drive them nuts is that I say, The author's intent is not the ultimate arbiter of a meaning. That I want you to think not in terms of what the author wants to do, but what the text wants you to do. And what we are focused on here is the text. So in some of my classes, I said, you cannot do any secondary research. Do not look at any historical stuff. Do not look at any kind of cultural context. Just figure out what this text is doing as a text itself. Now, of course, as a scholar, one of the things I love about literature is that in order to understand any literary text, you have to understand everything. That's the great thing about literature. But the foundation, this graph that's not up there anymore, is traditional literary analysis. To me, traditional literary analysis is not the author, but the words themselves. Okay, but Miranda, you want to say anything about that?
I mean, I guess that's the two things. Is one, definitely in my model of digital humanities and what I emerged from this class with, I do believe that traditional literary analysis is the foundation of your analysis. So I do think that if to you how the author views a piece is really important, that's part of what you want out of it, that's where you're starting. That's your traditional analysis. And because that's the whole point of designing this analysis interface, is that you are designing your own experience of the text. If that's what you want to get out of a text, you can definitely code programs that allow you to get at that. The data, the architecture of sentences, it's very unique to certain authors, or, however you want to look at it. Or you can even use the historical background to look for certain words and phrases that are in casual conversation. We definitely saw that was a theme throughout the class, is that some had like Mr. or, some casual conversation that was really hard to find in these traditional programs. So definitely, I don't think that's as out there as you think. It's something that we definitely talked about in the class. But I do think it goes along with what we're saying.
And the one more response, and then I'll get another question is, virtually everyone I know who's a literary scholar who does digital humanities stuff is absolutely committed to authorial, to finding out stuff about authors. Okay, there was let's see. Yeah, was your hand up? Yeah.
Yeah. Going back to the telltale heart, could you give us a specific instance of this analysis, the juxtapositions of words or the repetition, that gave you an insight that you wouldn't find through traditional literary analysis? Could you take a specific one and lead us through it?
Miranda's trying to go to a paper, I guess.
Let's see.
Seems like a game.
Wait.
I'm trying.
Yeah, that might be. It's going to be a little tricky, I think, because I don't remember precisely what happened in the class. So, but I'll wait. While I wait for Miranda, there was another hand.
There is an artist named Luc Dubois who
Yeah.
does this kind of analysis, and one of the
Yeah.
analyses he did was looked at all of the State of the Union speeches of
Right.
all of the presidents.
Right.
From his point of view, he did them in the most used words in an eye chart
Mm-hmm.
in that format.
Mhm.
If you look at that, you get such new insight
Right.
into the time and the president and everything else just by seeing the words
Right.
that appeared and their frequency
Yeah.
in the State of the Union.
I don't remember, getting back to your question, I don't remember, and maybe Miranda, you're going to respond to this, I don't remember what words I was surprised at that were more frequent and less frequent. But that's one of the things these tools makes available to you, that when you're reading, your response is understandably impressionistic. And when you get the computational tools, you can, well, let me give you an example in relation to not the telltale heart, and then I'll let you talk to it. There's a story that we also read called, which not as many people know, which is too bad, The Wife of His Youth by Charles Chesnut. Now again, I've taught this story a number of times. And towards the end of
we didn't hear what you
The
said.
Wife of His Youth by Charles Chesnut, late 19th century American short story, very famous amongst lit scholars. In the end of the story, a woman who speaks in dialect comes to talk to the protagonist, the main character. I have taught this story a number of times. She appears only very infrequently in the story, very small percentage in terms of when you're reading the story. When I first put this story into the computational tools, one of the things, and let me back up a second. I've read a bunch of the criticism on the story, so I know the kind of general take on the story. One of the things that surprised me when I put it into the computational tools was how the language she uses, which is very distinct, because it's dialect, is amongst the most frequent words. They're amongst the most frequent words in the story. And it shows you, one, how much she talks in the story, in ways that I was surprised nobody else had really picked up on or talked about in the scholarship. Two, and that alone had all kinds of implications for understanding the story, right? Here's this character who seems in some ways like a minor character in relation to her, the frequency of her appearance in the story. But the language that she uses in some ways overwhelms the very conventional language that it seems like 90% of the story used. So looking at it that way, I saw the story very differently. I saw the ending of the story, where she generally appears, very differently. And as I said, I tend to read the story now more in terms of how that language overwhelms, and that language then connects both her and the main character to a slave past that the story, for most of it, is trying to repress. So for me, I did that actually even before I taught the class. For me, that was a kind of revelatory moment about how computational tools can reveal stories that generally are engage impressionistically. Okay. Now
Yeah.
we're talking about Poe.
Okay, I mean, just one quick example. So what my paper was founded on was actually this graph right here, so what you're seeing is, I should maybe make this bigger. What you're seeing is I and he graphed against each other, which are two words that stop words actually get rid of, which is kind of annoying because I didn't notice it for a while. But this is in a relative frequency mode. So what you're seeing is the relative frequency of I versus he, which I is going to be more common because it's a first person tale, so it's told from a narrator's perspective. But what you see, or what I noticed, was how it's a completely inverse relationship. Every time I goes up, he plummets, and every time I goes down, he goes up. And for me, this almost really felt like two completely separate beings. I mean, what you're seeing, they're two different people. At the same time, this really felt like they almost didn't exist at the same time. This is almost like one was pushing the other out of the story. Because a lot of times you see people, especially with dialogue and stuff, you see them talking to each other or interacting with each other. And what this spurred for me was the concept of really these two beings were living within one. So it was two personas within one person's mind. And I really saw that, and there's other data to back it up and go through, but that was one thing that really triggered something for me.
So I'm going to go back to the title, continuity amidst transformation, right? Because what you did was you took this quote-unquote data and you interpreted it in the way that a literary scholar would interpret it. There's no right or wrong answer to this, right? It's merely the way you use the evidence to make a particular argument. You, in your paper, made a compelling argument using that data, but I could also hear somebody else making a different argument. It's not that different when you get down to it than what we've always done. We're just using this new methods of accessing the text and incorporating them into our traditional methods. Yes? Yes?
Yeah. One of the serious omissions in your interdisciplinary chart is the social sciences.
Yes.
Take an example of Sinclair Lewis's novels, Main Street, etc. I think it's Sauk Center, Indiana, something like that. Yeah. Now, there are sociological community studies done roughly at the same time in the early sort of to middle 20th century. One happens to be by Robert Lind, a sociologist at Columbia, whom I studied with, and his wife, who studied a community they called Middletown, which was Muncie, Indiana. So it's fairly close to the community that Sinclair Lewis was writing about. And one would be, if you put down fine arts and humanities as the only non-computer science type things to apply to those texts of Sinclair Lewis, you would be seriously lacking the fact that social scientists describe communities, and it would be very interesting to see how Sinclair Lewis, let's say satirically, changed community life from what a more, whatever you want to call it, social science. So I'm just reminding you that your education is, I have to say, seriously lacking. If you would have an interdisciplinary chart that omits social science applications to literature.
Okay, just a quick response to that one. There's definitely stuff that was missing that is just within a chart. There's also mathematics, which you didn't notice, that definitely I almost included. I considered it highly, both of those fields. At the same time, when approaching literature and the design process of actually creating literature, like if you read through the text, I was very much focused on the different processes used in these fields. And anthropology, I think I pulled one little thing from anthropology in my paper. So I did pull from it. At the same time, in creating the methodology, I felt that the other ones weighed more heavily in the digital humanities as a whole, rather than like an individual text. But the process I created was very much, it can be uniquely turned for any object you wanted to study.
I will take credit if one wants to, and I would disagree with this, call her education seriously lacking. I will take credit for that lack because I think it has to do with what we assign. And I think for the most part, Kelsey and Miranda, you'll say that the social sciences interesting in the digital humanities oftentimes are not highlighted. So I think that's partly why that comes through in that graph.
Because I also could have put history, mathematics, other things.
I'm going to interrupt here. It's 12 o'clock.
Yes.
It's a great opportunity to demonstrate what we're in the process of learning. So libraries have changed, scholarships have changed. Please join us.